The discovery came to me quite by accident, as the most disturbing revelations often do. I had been commissioned to research the genealogical records of Vermont's oldest families, a project that should have yielded nothing more remarkable than the usual litany of births, marriages, and unremarkable deaths that mark the passage of generations in small New England towns. But as I worked through the yellowed parish records of Millbrook, a pattern emerged that defied both logic and natural law. Between the years 1847 and 1923, 17 children were born to the Norwood family. Not one of them lived to see their 11th birthday. The death certificates lay before me in chronological order, each bearing the careful script of various town clerks and physicians across nearly 8 decades. The causes varied: consumption, scarlet fever, accidents, sudden fevers of unknown origin, yet each certificate bore the same curious notation in faded ink along the right margin: the arrangement fulfilled. I found myself returning to that phrase repeatedly, turning it over in my mind like a smooth stone worn by countless hands. Millbrook itself sits in a valley between 2 ranges of hills, the kind of place where morning mist clings to the ground well into autumn afternoons, and where winter arrives early and departs reluctantly. The town reached its peak prosperity in the late 19th century, sustained by lumber mills and the railroad that carried Vermont timber to the growing cities of the South. Yet even during those prosperous decades, one constant remained: the gradual, methodical diminishment of the Norwood children. The Norwood estate still stands on Elm Hill Road, though no one has called it home since 1924. The Victorian Manor rises from overgrown grounds like something from a fever dream, its gingerbread trim now weathered to the color of old bone, its tall windows staring blindly across the valley. Local real estate records show 17 separate attempts to sell the property over the past century. None succeeded. The house seems to resist habitation with the same quiet persistence that characterized the deaths of its original inhabitants. I began to understand that what I had uncovered was not merely a genealogical curiosity, but something far more troubling. The town's prosperity had coincided exactly with the span of years during which Norwood children died with such terrible regularity. When the last child perished in the winter of 1923, Millbrook's fortunes began their slow, inexorable decline. The mills closed within a decade. The railroad stopped running passenger service. Young people left for opportunities elsewhere and rarely returned. Standing in the Millbrook Historical Society that gray October afternoon, surrounded by the accumulated detritus of a town's fading glory, I found myself confronting a question that would haunt the months of research to follow. What price had this quiet Vermont community paid for its brief moment of prosperity, and who among them had been willing to collect that payment from children who had no choice in the matter? The parish records offered no answers, only the stark arithmetic of lives cut short with mechanical precision. But they did provide a starting point, a thread that would lead me deeper into a story that the good people of Millbrook had spent the better part of a century trying to forget. Ezekiel Norwood arrived in Millbrook in the spring of 1847, carrying little more than a leather satchel and the acrid smell of smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes for weeks after his arrival. The fire that had consumed his previous homestead in Arkham, Massachusetts, had left him with nothing but debts and the growing suspicion among his former neighbors that the blaze had been no accident. Local newspapers from the period describe him as a man of middle years, unremarkable in appearance, save for an intensity of purpose that made others uncomfortable in his presence. What drew him to Millbrook remains unclear, though town records suggest he arrived with knowledge that should have been impossible for an outsider to possess. Within days of his arrival, he had located and purchased not merely a tract of land, but what longtime residents referred to in hushed tones as the arrangement, a compact whose origins predated the founding of the town itself. The land Ezekiel chose had been avoided by previous settlers for reasons that varied depending on who told the story. Some spoke of harsh winters that seemed to linger longer in that particular valley. Others mentioned the way animals avoided the area, how domestic livestock would refuse to graze there even during the leanest seasons. The Abenaki who had once hunted these hills had their own stories, speaking of a place where the boundary between the world of the living and something else had grown dangerously thin. Yet it was precisely this cursed ground that Ezekiel claimed for his own, paying not in currency, but in something the deed cryptically referred to as future considerations. The transaction was witnessed by three of Millbrook's most prominent citizens, Judge Cornelius Blackwood, Merchant Samuel Crane, and Pastor Reverend Elias Thorne. None of their descendants would speak of the arrangement when I contacted them during my research, though several mentioned family legends about prosperity that came at too high a price. Construction of the Norwood Manor began that same summer, built according to architectural plans that seemed to change nightly. Workers reported arriving to find alterations to their previous day's labor, doorways bricked up overnight, new rooms appearing where none had been planned, staircases that led to walls instead of upper floors. Yet they continued their work, driven by wages that far exceeded what any other employer in the valley could offer. The house that emerged from this troubled construction defied easy description. 7 gables crowned its slate roof, each oriented toward a different compass point, as if the structure were designed to watch all approaches simultaneously. The windows were set in patterns that hurt the eye to contemplate for too long, creating the impression that the house was not merely looking out at the world, but actively studying it. Most unsettling of all were the children's rooms on the 3rd floor, 13 identical chambers arranged in a perfect circle around a central nursery whose purpose no one could adequately explain. Within a year of completing the manor, Ezekiel's fortunes had transformed dramatically. His investments in lumber and railroad stock proved extraordinarily prescient, yielding returns that defied market logic. Merchants sought his partnership, politicians courted his favor, and the most eligible women in 3 counties began to find reasons to call upon his remote estate. It was as if success simply radiated from him like heat from a forge, touching everything in his vicinity with the golden promise of prosperity. It was also during this first year that Ezekiel married Catherine Morse, a young woman of good family whose previous suitors had all suffered remarkably similar fates, sudden business failures that left them unable to support a wife. Their wedding was the social event of the decade, attended by luminaries from as far away as Boston, though several guests later reported feeling inexplicably uneasy throughout the ceremony, as if they were witnessing not a celebration, but a transaction of some darker nature. The first Norwood child was born in the winter of 1848, a son they named Jonathan. The boy was healthy, intelligent, and possessed of the same unsettling intensity that marked his father. Local daguerreotypes from the period show a child with eyes that seemed far older than his years, as if he carried knowledge that no child should possess. Jonathan lived exactly 10 years, dying on the eve of his 11th birthday from what Dr. Thaddeus Crane described as a failure of the vital spark, for reasons that medical science cannot adequately explain. It was with Jonathan's death that the true nature of Ezekiel's arrangement began to reveal itself, though it would be decades before anyone dared to speak the truth aloud. The ledger came to light in 1987, during the most recent attempt to renovate the Norwood Manor. A construction crew hired to update the electrical system discovered it sealed within a cavity in the library wall, wrapped in oilcloth and preserved with the kind of care usually reserved for the most precious family documents. The contractor who found it, a man named Robert Hayes, later described the moment of discovery as profoundly unsettling, not because of what the ledger contained, which he could not have known at the time, but because of the way it seemed to radiate cold, even in the warm August afternoon. Hayes delivered the ledger to the Millbrook Historical Society, where it remained unopened for several weeks. The society's president, Martha Crane, great-granddaughter of the Dr. Crane who had attended so many Norwood deaths, reported that none of the volunteers felt comfortable handling the thing. It was not merely the age of the leather binding or the faint odor of decay that clung to it, but something more fundamental. The ledger seemed to resist examination, as if it contained secrets that were never meant to see daylight. When the ledger was finally opened, its contents defied every assumption about the nature of Ezekiel Norwood's prosperity. The entries, written in 3 distinct hands across 7 decades, revealed a meticulous accounting system that tracked not monetary transactions, but something far more precious and terrible. Each page was divided into columns: date, child's name, age at death, and what Ezekiel had termed benefits received. The pattern was undeniable. Jonathan's death in 1858 coincided with Ezekiel's most successful lumber contract, a deal that established his fortune and secured his position among Millbrook's elite. Mary Elizabeth's passing in 1863 preceded a railroad investment that should have been ruinous, but instead yielded profits beyond all reasonable expectation. Thomas fell ill and died in 1869, just weeks before a rival businessman suffered a mysterious accident that eliminated Ezekiel's only serious competition for lucrative government contracts. The entries continued through the decades, each death corresponding with some material benefit that further enhanced the Norwood family's wealth and influence. What made the ledger particularly disturbing was not merely the cold calculation it revealed, but the growing desperation evident in the later entries. Ezekiel's son Cornelius, who had inherited both the estate and the arrangement upon his father's death in 1881, wrote with an increasingly unsteady hand as he documented the deaths of his own children. By the 1890s, Cornelius's entries had taken on the quality of a confession. Marginal notes revealed his growing horror at the compact his father had made, his desperate attempts to find some means of escape from obligations that seemed to have been written in something more binding than ink. He had consulted spiritualists, theologians, and practitioners of older forms of knowledge, seeking some loophole in the arrangement that might spare his remaining children. The ledger's most revealing entry appeared in 1897, written in Cornelius's hand but in ink so faded it was barely legible. The boundary weakens only in winter when the veil grows thin. Each child taken strengthens the compact for another generation. I have found no means of escape, no price that will satisfy the debt save the one agreed upon. God forgive us all for what we have done, and what we continue to do in pursuit of earthly prosperity. Perhaps most disturbing of all were the entries that appeared after Cornelius's death in 1902, written in a hand that matched none of the known Norwood family members. These final entries, spanning the years from 1903 to 1923, were signed only with the initial A and seemed to document not just the deaths of the remaining Norwood children, but the growing awareness among Millbrook's citizens of the true cost of their community's prosperity. The ledger's final entry, dated December 21, 1923, consisted of a single line written in that same unknown hand. The arrangement requires new participants. The Norwood line has served its purpose and will now be released from further obligation. Below this, in different ink and clearly added later, someone had written, "But at what cost to those who remain?" The ledger provided answers to questions that had haunted my research, but it also raised far more disturbing possibilities. If the Norwood family had indeed been bound by some supernatural compact, what had become of that arrangement after the family's disappearance? Had it simply dissolved with the death of its primary participants, or had it found new ways to perpetuate itself among the surviving residents of Millbrook? The construction crew that discovered the ledger disbanded within a month of its finding, citing personal reasons for abandoning what should have been a lucrative renovation contract. Robert Hayes, the contractor who first handled the document, suffered a series of business failures that left him bankrupt within 2 years. When I attempted to contact him during my research, his widow informed me that he had died in his sleep during the winter of 1989, exactly 2 years after opening that sealed wall in the Norwood Library. The deeper I delved into Millbrook's history, the more apparent it became that the Norwood arrangement had never been a private compact between one family and whatever forces they had chosen to court. The town itself had been complicit, bound by chains of prosperity and willful ignorance that made every citizen a participant in the systematic sacrifice of innocence. Evidence of this complicity appeared in the most mundane records. Town council minutes from the 1870s reveal heated debates about the Norwood situation, discussions that invariably ended with decisions to allow the family to manage their private affairs without municipal interference. Newspaper editorials from the period praised the Norwood family's charitable contributions while carefully avoiding any mention of the tragic regularity with which their children perished. Perhaps most damning were the medical records maintained by Dr. Thaddeus Crane, the physician who attended every Norwood death between 1858 and 1902. Dr. Crane's private notes, preserved by his family and made available to researchers only after his great-granddaughter's death in 1995, reveal a man increasingly tormented by his role in perpetuating the arrangement. The medical reports themselves defied logical explanation. Each child, regardless of their supposed cause of death, exhibited identical symptoms in their final hours: a dropping of body temperature that no amount of warming could counteract, eyes that lost their color until they resembled winter ice, and a peculiar stillness that seemed to begin at their extremities and work steadily inward toward their heart. Most disturbing of all was Dr. Crane's observation that each child seemed aware of their approaching death, accepting it with a resignation that no child should possess. Dr. Crane's notes grew increasingly erratic as the decades passed. Entries from the 1880s describe his growing suspicion that the children's deaths were not natural, despite their varied official causes. By the 1890s, he was documenting strange phenomena that accompanied each death: temperatures that dropped throughout the house regardless of weather conditions, the sound of footsteps in empty rooms, and shadows that moved independently of any light source. The Mosin, and revealing entry in Dr. Crane's records dated from December 1895, written after the death of young Patricia Norwood. I can no longer deny what my eyes have witnessed. The child did not die of pneumonia, nor any ailment known to medical science. Something came for her in the night, something that left no trace save the profound cold that still lingers in her room 3 days after her passing. I have become complicit in murders most foul, yet I cannot bring myself to speak against the Norwoods, for their prosperity has become our prosperity, and their arrangement has made us all wealthy beyond our means. The town's complicity extended beyond medical professionals. School records show that Norwood children were regularly excused from classes during their final months, ostensibly for health reasons, but more likely to prevent other students from witnessing their gradual transformation. Teachers' notes describe the Norwood children as becoming increasingly withdrawn as they approached their 10th birthdays, as if they were slowly disappearing even before death claimed them. Local clergy proved equally compromised. Sunday service records from 3 different churches show that Norwood children stopped attending religious services approximately 6 months before their deaths, despite their families' continued participation. When questioned about this pattern, Reverend Elias Thorne explained in a letter to his bishop that the children seemed to find the sacred environment incompatible with their family's particular spiritual obligations. The arrangement's influence on Millbrook's prosperity was undeniable. Every major business success in the town could be traced to the immediate aftermath of a Norwood death. The lumber mill's most profitable years corresponded exactly with the loss of children. Railroad contracts were signed within weeks of funerals. Even smaller businesses found themselves inexplicably busy following each tragedy, as if the entire community benefited from the terrible compact that the Norwood family had entered. Yet the most chilling evidence of the town's complicity came from the residents themselves. Oral histories collected in the 1960s, when many of the arrangement's contemporary witnesses were still alive, reveal a community that had chosen comfort over conscience. Elderly residents spoke of the difficult times when the Norwood children grew ill, periods when neighbors avoided the family while simultaneously profiting from their suffering. One particularly telling interview was conducted with Eleanor Blackwood, granddaughter of Judge Cornelius Blackwood, who had witnessed Ezekiel's original land purchase. In 1967, at the age of 83, Eleanor finally spoke about the arrangement that had shaped her community. We all knew, you understand, perhaps not the details, but we knew that the Norwood prosperity came at a price, and we knew that price was paid by those poor children. We told ourselves it was not our concern, that each family must manage their own affairs. We told ourselves many things to sleep at night while children died to keep our town wealthy. When asked why no one had intervened, Eleanor's response chilled the interviewer. Because we feared that if the arrangement were broken, whatever had been feeding on those children might turn its attention to the rest of us. Better that a few should suffer than all should perish. It was this confession that made me Father Michael O'Brien, the Catholic priest who served Millbrook's small Irish community, initially dismissed Margaret's concerns as the product of grief and isolation. His attitude changed dramatically after his first visit to the Norwood estate. In a letter to his bishop later found among diocesan archives, Father O'Brien described encountering something fundamentally opposed to the presence of the divine within the manor's walls. He attempted to bless the house and perform prayers for the protection of the children, but reported that his efforts seemed to make the supernatural presence stronger rather than weaker. As conventional remedies failed, Margaret's research led her into older, more dangerous forms of knowledge. The estate's library contained volumes that predated Ezekiel's arrival in Millbrook, books that seemed to have been waiting for future generations of Norwoods to discover them. Through these texts, Margaret learned that the arrangement was not merely a supernatural contract, but a form of spiritual parasitism that grew stronger with each sacrifice. The diary entries from November 1923 reveal Margaret's growing understanding of her family's true situation. The thing that feeds upon our children does not simply kill them. It consumes their life force to sustain something that should have perished long ago. Each death makes it stronger, more capable of demanding further tribute. I fear that if Edmund and Edgar are taken, the arrangement will no longer be satisfied with 2 children per generation. It will require more, always more, until every child in Millbrook belongs to it. Margaret's most desperate stratagem involved an attempt to physically remove her children from the arrangement's influence. In early December, she loaded Edmund and Edgar into her automobile and began a journey that should have taken them far from Vermont's borders. Instead, she found herself driving in circles, covering the same roads repeatedly, despite her careful attention to landmarks and direction. The diary entry from December 10th describes this futile escape attempt. "We have been driving for 6 hours, yet every road leads back to Millbrook. The boys ask why we cannot leave, and I have no answer that would not terrify them further. It is as if the arrangement has created a boundary that we cannot cross, invisible walls that grow stronger as winter deepens." The supernatural forces arrayed against Margaret's efforts grew more active as the twins' birthday approached. The house itself seemed to resist her presence, with doors that refused to open and stairs that creaked ominously under her feet. More disturbing were the voices that echoed through the empty rooms, the laughter and whispers of children who had died decades earlier, calling to Edmund and Edgar with promises of games and companionship in some darker realm. The twins themselves began to change as December progressed. Their normally vibrant personalities grew subdued, and they spent increasing amounts of time staring out the windows toward the forest that surrounded the estate. When Margaret asked what they were looking at, Edmund replied with words that chilled his mother. "They're waiting for us, Mama, our brothers and sisters who went before. They say it doesn't hurt, and that we'll all be together afterward." Margaret's final diary entry, dated December 20th, 1923, one day before the twins' 11th birthday, reveals the terrible choice that confronted her. "I have found only one way to break the arrangement, but the cost is greater than any mother should be asked to bear. The thing that feeds upon our children requires the willing sacrifice of innocence to maintain its power. But if there are no innocents left to take, if the bloodline ends completely, then its hold over this place must weaken. I pray that God will forgive what I am about to do, and that my children will understand that there are fates worse than death." On the morning of December 21st, 1923, neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the Norwood estate. By the time the volunteer fire department arrived, the house stood empty and undamaged, but Margaret and her 2 sons had vanished completely. No bodies were ever found, no trace of their departure discovered. It was as if the final generation of Norwoods had simply stepped out of the world, leaving behind only the lingering question of whether Margaret had found a way to cheat the arrangement or had merely become its final victim. The only clue to their fate was found in the estate's nursery, where someone had written on the wall in what appeared to be charcoal. "The circle is broken, but the boundary remains. What was fed by children's blood will hunger still, and Millbrook will remember the price of refusing to pay what is owed." In the century that has passed since the Norwood family's disappearance, their estate has acquired a reputation that extends far beyond the borders of Millbrook. The house stands exactly as it was left in 1923, preserved by some force that seems to resist the natural decay that claims all human constructions. Paint does not peel from its walls, roof slates do not slip from their moorings, and the glass in its windows remains clear despite decades of New England weather. This supernatural preservation has attracted a steady stream of visitors over the decades. Paranormal investigators, curiosity seekers, and unfortunates drawn by the same dark magnetism that once lured Ezekiel Norwood to purchase cursed ground. None have remained long, and few have spoken openly about their experiences within the house's walls. The first systematic attempt to document the estate's paranormal activity came in 1952, when a team from Harvard University's psychology department spent 3 nights in the house as part of a study on the relationship between suggestion and supernatural experience. The team, led by Professor James Whitmore, entered the investigation as committed skeptics, determined to provide rational explanations for the local folklore surrounding the property. Professor Whitmore's official report, filed with the university, described the investigation as inconclusive but noted several anomalies that defied easy explanation. Temperatures within the house fluctuated dramatically without apparent cause, dropping as much as 20 degrees in certain rooms while remaining normal in others. Recording equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, producing sounds that bore no relationship to the ambient environment. Most disturbing of all were the photographs taken throughout the investigation, which revealed shadowy figures in rooms that had been empty when the pictures were taken. The professor's private notes, made available to researchers only after his death in 1987, told a more unsettling story. On the investigation's second night, Whitmore reported hearing children's voices singing lullabies in rooms that had been sealed for decades. When he followed the sounds to their source, he found himself in the third-floor nursery where the temperature had dropped so dramatically that his breath formed visible clouds in the frigid air. The investigation's most disturbing incident occurred on the final night, when graduate student Eleanor Chase became separated from the team while exploring the house's basement. She was found 6 hours later in the nursery, unconscious and suffering from severe hypothermia, despite the fact that the room's temperature registered normal on all measuring devices. When Eleanor regained consciousness, she claimed to have spent the night playing games with 17 children who told her their names and described how they had died. More informal visitors have reported experiences that followed disturbingly consistent patterns. Contractors hired to perform routine maintenance describe tools that move overnight, work that is mysteriously undone between visits, and the persistent feeling of being watched by unseen observers. Several have reported encountering children in period clothing who vanish when approached directly, leaving behind only the lingering scent of winter air and the sound of distant laughter. Local teenagers, drawn by the irresistible combination of danger and dare, have made the Norwood estate a rite of passage for generations. The brave or foolish few who manage to spend entire nights in the house invariably emerge with stories that share common elements. Rooms that change configuration in darkness, mirrors that reflect faces that are not their own, and dreams of joining endless games of hide-and-seek with playmates who cast no shadows. Perhaps most revealing are the accounts of those visitors who arrive with skeptical intentions but leave as believers. Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a descendant of the judge who witnessed Ezekiel's original land purchase, came to the estate in 1995 as part of her research into family history. She intended to spend the night in the house to prove to herself that the family legends were merely superstition. Her experience, documented in a letter to her sister, provides insight into the estate's continuing influence. I entered the house at dusk, armed with rational explanations for every supposed supernatural phenomenon. I left before dawn, convinced that some tragedies leave scars that never heal. The children are still there, Sarah. All 17 of them, trapped in that house by an arrangement that death could not dissolve. They showed me things, memories of their final days, glimpses of what claimed them, and worst of all, their understanding that they could not rest while the debt their family incurred remains unpaid. The house itself seems to serve as a kind of supernatural recording device, preserving not just the physical evidence of the Norwood tragedy, but the emotional resonance of decades of suffering. Visitors report experiencing intense feelings of sadness and loss while walking through rooms where children once lived and died. Some describe hearing fragments of conversations from decades past, echoes of family dinners and bedtime stories that continue to play out in endless repetition. Modern technology has proven inadequate to document the estate's supernatural activity. Digital cameras malfunction, producing images filled with unexplained distortions. Audio recording equipment captures sounds that exist on no known frequency, while electromagnetic field detectors register readings that should be impossible in a structure built entirely of wood and stone. The estate's resistance to modern intervention extends beyond mere supernatural phenomena. Despite numerous attempts at renovation, the house remains essentially unchanged from its 1923 configuration. Electrical systems installed in the 1960s failed within months, with wiring that corroded at rates that defied all understanding of material science. Plumbing updates suffer similar fates, with pipes that develop leaks in impossible locations and fixtures that break without cause. It is as if the house exists partially outside the normal flow of time, anchored to that terrible winter when the last Norwood children faced their destiny. Those who spend time within its walls report experiencing temporal dislocations, clocks that run backward, calendars that show impossible dates, and the overwhelming sensation that the past is more real than the present. The estate stands as a monument to questions that rational minds prefer not to ask. What happens when the innocent suffer for the ambitions of their elders? And can some wounds be too deep for time to heal? I began this investigation as a genealogist seeking to document the histories of Vermont's founding families. I am ending it as something else entirely, a witness to the terrible persistence of evil that masquerades as respectability, and a reluctant chronicler of truths that perhaps should have remained buried in dusty archives and forgotten records. The Norwood story is not merely a tale of supernatural horror, though it certainly contains elements that defy rational explanation. It is, more fundamentally, a meditation on the prices we are willing to pay for prosperity and the ways in which entire communities can become complicit in unspeakable acts through the simple expedient of looking away when conscience demands action. Millbrook today bears little resemblance to the prosperous town that once thrived on the suffering of 17 children. The mills have long since closed, their machinery sold for scrap or left to rust in buildings that now serve as monuments to industrial decline. The railroad that once carried Vermont timber to distant markets has been converted to a walking trail used primarily by tourists seeking autumn foliage and small-town charm. The young people leave for opportunities elsewhere and rarely return, creating a demographic spiral that seems to mirror the fate of the Norwood line itself. Yet the residents who remain carry the weight of their community's history in ways both subtle and profound. Conversations with elderly Millbrook natives reveal a persistent unease about their town's past, a reluctance to examine too closely the foundations upon which their grandparents' prosperity was built. Many families possess heirlooms and keepsakes that date from the town's golden age, objects that somehow made their way into private hands after the Norwood estate was abandoned. Few are willing to discuss how these items were acquired, or why they remain carefully stored in attics and basements rather than displayed with pride. The question that haunts my research is whether the arrangement that claimed the Norwood children truly ended with their disappearance, or whether it merely entered a dormant phase, waiting for conditions that might allow its revival. Margaret Norwood's final diary entry spoke of breaking the circle while leaving the boundary intact, a distinction whose implications grow more troubling the longer I contemplate them. Evidence suggests that something continues to stir within the boundaries that once defined the Norwood arrangement. Local birth records show an unusual pattern of infant mortality in Millbrook that has persisted since 1924, a rate significantly higher than surrounding communities despite access to modern medical care. More disturbing are the reports from the Regional Hospital of Children born with what medical professionals describe as failure to thrive, a condition characterized by the same dropping of body temperature and loss of vital force that Dr. Crane documented in his records of Norwood deaths. The estate itself remains the focal point of whatever forces the original arrangement unleashed. Despite decades of abandonment, the property shows no signs of the decay that should have claimed a 19th-century wooden structure. Local weather patterns seem to bend around the house, creating microclimates that persist regardless of seasonal changes. Most unsettling of all are the reports from hikers and hunters who encounter children in period clothing throughout the forest that surrounds the estate, children who vanish when approached, but whose laughter can be heard echoing through the trees long after they disappear. I have spent the better part of 2 years researching the Norwood family and their compact with forces that conventional wisdom insists do not exist. The evidence I have uncovered suggests that such wisdom is not merely wrong, but dangerously naive. There are arrangements older than our understanding, compacts that bind not just individuals but entire communities to obligations that persist across generations. The residents of Millbrook learned too late that prosperity earned through the suffering of innocence carries a price that compounds with each generation. They discovered that turning away from evil does not make one innocent of its consequences, but merely complicit in its perpetuation. Most troubling of all, they found that some debts cannot be discharged by the death of the original debtor, but must be paid by descendants who had no voice in the original compact. As I write these final words, winter is approaching in Vermont. The leaves have fallen from the trees that surround the Norwood estate, and the first frost has appeared on windows throughout Millbrook. Local residents are already commenting on the unusual severity of the cold, the way it seems to settle into their bones with a persistence that defies all attempts at warmth. I find myself wondering whether the arrangement that claimed 17 children over 7 decades is truly dormant, or whether it is simply waiting for the proper conditions to resume its terrible harvest. The boundary that Margaret Norwood spoke of in her final diary entry remains intact, a spiritual wound in the fabric of reality that continues to fester despite the passage of time. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the Norwood story, that some evils are too fundamental to be destroyed, only contained, and that the price of containment must be paid by each generation that chooses to live within the shadow of what their predecessors have done. The children are still singing in the woods around Millbrook, their voices carried on winter winds that bring news of hungers that have not been satisfied, only temporarily appeased. Those who listen carefully can hear them calling, inviting others to join their endless games in a realm where innocence lost can never be recovered, but where the debts of the living continue to accumulate interest that must someday be paid in full. What remains is a question that each generation must answer for itself. What price are we willing to pay for prosperity, and who among us will be asked to make that payment? The arrangement endures, patient as winter, certain as death, waiting for those who believe that some bargains are too profitable to refuse.